Hey everyone, and welcome to my talk today. In order to have future foresight, it requires that we look back at events that have already taken place. And that is what I'll be doing in my talk today. I'll be presenting a retrospective of 2020, looking at all of the major security news and events that have taken place in the past year, as well as some commentary and analysis from myself. This is the third year that I'm presenting such a talk at this conference, although this year is under slightly different circumstances. Just a quick introduction about myself. I'm a cloud architect. I specialize in security and enterprise cloud architecture. My research interests include privacy, security, and disinformation. I have a number of AWS certifications and working on getting some additional certifications over the next year. I have a new upcoming website called Critical Void, which explores the intersection of science, technology, and culture through the lens of information security. It's not public yet, but will be in the near future, and I hope that you will read it when it is public. My Twitter handle is @Naude. I will be tweeting out a Twitter thread throughout this talk with links to some of the things that I'm going to cover in this talk today. So my talk will cover 2020, including all of the major news stories, including COVID-19, which is the major theme of 2020, with some additional themes around that, which includes phishing, disinformation, online game cheating, the insider threat, satellite security, and some of the trends that we've seen in malware and ransomware over the past year. The first major theme is remote working. So as the pandemic took over and infection started to spread across the world, we saw a lot of hoarding taking place and people started going into lockdown from the first week of March. By April, at least 80 countries had some form of lockdown in place and people had to start working remotely from home. Many countries already had some kind of remote working before the pandemic took over, with the Netherlands leading the pack at about 14% of the population having some kind of remote working agreements already in place. So some of the major challenges that companies experienced with remote working was that they didn't have enough laptops to send home to their employees, since many of them rely on desktop machines. Many companies had to go procure additional laptops, and with the shipping restrictions in place, this was quite a challenge. Many of them had to resort to second-hand laptops or laptops that were destined to be recycled. Companies also allowed their employees to use personal devices, and many of these devices were shared in the family. So mom and dad would use the device during the day, and then the child would use the device in the evening to play games on. This poses a massive security threat because the child would often download unwanted software or potentially malware, which would put the information stored on that device at risk. Many companies also lacked BYOD, or bring your own device, or as I like to call it, bring your own disaster policies. Many families experienced problems with space, not having, dedicated offices, or sometimes having to share space in their apartments, which could sometimes cause problems. VPNs were another big problem, where concentrators were not designed to handle the load that they were expected to handle, and new concentrators had to be purchased. Threat intel and user behavioral analytics tools also started misbehaving as the employees started working remotely on these new devices coming in from unknown IP. Sometimes a lot of these tools would create false positives of suspicious activity or anomalous activity. Personally, we saw with AWS Guard Duty, as people were working remotely, that we started to see dozens and hundreds of alerts starting to get fired as a result of this. This all collectively led to the meme going around as to who really led digital transformation in the company. It was definitely COVID-19 and not some C-level executive. So one of the big challenges over the past year was patch management and who should pay for data during upgrades. So a lot of administrative staff were sent home with laptops and data bundles between 3 to 5 gigabytes that were more than sufficient for the employees to do their work. However, when they needed to do updates on these devices, that is where they would run into problems, since their data allowance wouldn't be enough to cover their work and for the updates to take place. Depending on the software installed on the machines, these updates could easily total 15 to 20 gigabytes, especially finance, engineering, and design software. Many companies experienced problems with doing updates from their on-premise networks because they had policies in place which would prevent updates from taking place over VPN due to the bandwidth constraints that they had in their data centers. And sometimes the subnets needed to do the updates were also not available on the VPN, sometimes intentionally for bandwidth reasons. We also saw a lot of sys administrators were reluctant to push new GPOs over VPN connections, mainly PTSD from Windows Server 2003 and 2012, where GPOs would often fail when they were pushed over remote connections. The perimeter controls were another big issue where a lot of traffic had to be backhauled into the data center to break out to the proxies. And since a lot of large corporates have legacy network topologies where they may have multiple buildings and each building is then dedicated a set of proxies with the ability to fail over between them. However, when everybody is working remotely, this design often can fall flat. And a lot of companies had challenges dealing with internet access from their devices. One of the things that we saw with remote working is the increase in cloud adoption, where many companies used the scalability and elasticity of the cloud to address their work from home challenges. What we also saw then was a lot of cloud providers starting to have capacity constraints, especially Microsoft Azure. One of the best practices when you go through your cloud journey and as you adopt cloud is to look at workloads that can be turned off when they are not needed. This would typically be over weekends and during evenings. However, if you were to actually do that and you switched off your workloads when they were not needed and you happen to be a Microsoft Azure customer, there was a very real risk that you wouldn't be able to bring that workload up when you actually needed it. And this is a massive risk that companies needed to address, and also potentially leading to awkward situations with C-level executives when production workloads could not be brought up. So as people started working from home, we saw that the workday started to increase. A study done on 3.1 million people showed that the average workday increased by 48 minutes, something which was actually backed up by browser telemetry. So this is actually something we saw in our Microsoft Teams usage. We adopted Microsoft Teams about 2 years ago, initially moving away from Slack due to the features that Microsoft Teams had, as well as from a licensing perspective. We've seen in the data that our teams are highly effective with remote working, including working on the weekends and in the evenings, which is not ideal. One of our favorite features of Microsoft Teams is the fact that we can record meetings that then get published to stream. We host many tech sessions at our company, and being able to build a catalog of these videos as we have these meetings with very little effort is something that's very valuable to us. What we saw earlier this year was that Slack filed an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft for the success of their Microsoft Teams product in the EU, which is ironic since Slack created a newspaper advert really embracing Microsoft Teams when the product was first announced. With all of the remote working, we saw a lot of companies embracing video conferencing and remote collaboration tools. This all led to a massive spike in bandwidth that we saw on the internet exchanges, where many internet exchanges saw a growth between 25 and 75%. Some internet exchanges saw the amount of data that they had to process doubling or even tripling in some instances. Most of this traffic was video conferencing, VoIP, entertainment, and cloud gaming related. And here's just some graphs that we saw from eKicks that really shows the increase in traffic. Many ISPs had to take action to keep their network stable. Many of these actions included moving their traffic around and prioritizing certain traffic over others, which actually goes against net neutrality rules. But they did this in order to keep their network performant and stable, something that the regulators also agreed was okay for them to do. And some of these ISPs had to trade some resilience in their network in order to gain performance to keep their users happy. With the remote working situation. A lot of companies had to embrace video conferencing, and many of them rushed to embrace Zoom. And due to their self-service platform, they really happened to be quite successful. Zoom saw their revenue double from $910 million to $1.79 billion on their last earnings call. They are seeing 300 million participants per day, with countless schools and universities around the world using their services. A lot of privacy and security flaws have been brought up by various security professionals, and one of the big problems was the issue of Zoom bombing, where teenagers or sometimes other individuals would go onto these calls and would start bombing the session through the use of profanity. Sometimes they would turn on their camera and they wouldn't have any clothes on, and this was quite a big challenge that a lot of people had. Some of the security and privacy concerns that were raised include their false claims about end-to-end encryption, an attention tracking feature that got a lot of negative press, user data that was being sent to Facebook, no email verification on accounts, and various security flaws that could expose highly sensitive data. There was also a flaw that allowed privilege escalation on both Windows and macOS, and the Zoom client, when uninstalled on macOS, didn't remove the web server that was running on the device. Apple had to use their own services in order to go remove that web server off macOS devices. So as Zoom was going through this trial by fire, the Zoom CEO hired Alex Stamos, the ex-CISO of Facebook, to help run some of the security programs at Zoom. One of the first things that Alex did was he initiated a 90-day freeze period so that they could address various security vulnerabilities and privacy concerns, and only once that was done would he allow new features to be rolled out to the product. Alex was also key in the acquisition of Keybase by Zoom. Keybase had been working on their own video conferencing solution that supported end-to-end encryption, which was then incorporated into Zoom. And Zoom announced then that they would offer free end-to-end encryption to their paying customers. They received a lot of criticism over this because it was only for paying customers and they wanted everybody to get it. Eventually, Zoom caved and said that all users will get free end-to-end encryption. And they then recently rolled this out about a month ago. So end-to-end encryption is now possible with Zoom. So what we saw with the pandemic is the emergence of remote courts, hearings, and sessions. Most of them took place on Zoom. At the bottom of the slide, you can see an example of a courtroom. I believe that's a federal court. The screenshots above that is actually a YouTuber that I followed that had to close a probate deal in court. He had to share highly sensitive financial information, which was actually done over a screen share, which is one of the bad things about these remote court proceedings. However, there are many benefits, including the timing and convenience to participants, the transparency that it enables, and witness credibility, where judges can actually see the emotions better over Zoom of participants than they can sometimes in courtrooms. And in child custody cases, the first-hand home assessment that can be done by the judge is sometimes very beneficial in making a decision as to who should gain custody over a child. This all led to Zoom stock performing really well, with Zoom stock increasing by over 638%. In March, a lot of investors were buying the wrong Zoom stock, and the SEC actually had to step in and ban the other Zoom stock from being traded on the stock exchanges. One of the funny things was that these tech giants had to testify before Congress on WebEx, which is, just a terrible product, and I think it was quite frustrating for some of them. You could also see the various highly staged backgrounds, especially with Jeff Bezos. He's clearly sitting on a stage with very high quality lighting there. So one of the good things with the pandemic is that a lot of the tools for media creation, video conferencing, live streaming, and collaboration have gotten a lot better. Even when things go back to normal, this is going to be a huge win for us. In this example, I'm showing Glenn Weiss, an Emmy-winning director, directing the DNC conference remotely over Zoom. And you can also see photos of the Emmys where they sent 140 video production kits to various celebrities so that they could join remotely. Companies that have enabled and embraced remote working technologies have seen their stocks soar. Many companies saw triple-digit growth, which is very unusual in the stock market. One of the big themes of 2020 was zero trust. Now, zero trust in the past has always been tied to network isolation. However, to get the true benefit of zero trust, we need to look at how identity, context, and the state of an endpoint or device can be evaluated in order for a specific action to be allowed. And this is something that Google's BeyondCorp has been able to do. They have expanded their BeyondCorp alliance to push zero trust further, including announcing various partnerships over the past year. Cloudflare added additional features to Cloudflare Access, as well as announcing Cloudflare One, which merges a lot of their existing products with features that enable enterprises to push zero trust in a very tangible way. We also saw the announcement of Hashicorp Boundary, a new open source product to enable zero trust, which also merges the identity and network isolation that's needed for zero trust. And I'm really excited to see where this project goes over the next few years. So one of the other big themes of 2020 was phishing. As the pandemic took over, a lot of phishing kits rapidly started adopting COVID-19 lures. A lot of them claimed to be from authoritative sources, for example, government or public healthcare. A lot of these phishing campaigns were used for credential theft, identity theft, and malware and ransom deployment. Domain Tools has a list of 154,000 domains that were linked to COVID-19 phishing. Over 1,000 phishing domains were being registered per day, and often these phishing campaigns would use emotionally charged language in order to get people to click on them. And Google also announced earlier in the year that they were blocking about 18 million coronavirus scam emails per day. And these are some of the examples of the phishing emails that went around, many of them coming from authoritative sources like the World Health Organization or various public health entities. Some of these scams would claim that somebody that was close to you had been recently infected with COVID-19 and you had to take action on that. Some of these emails just plain dropped ransomware or malware onto the victim's machine. What we saw with US stimulus is that a $2 trillion care package was announced to stimulate the economy. This included funding for stimulus checks, unemployment checks, as well as help for corporations and small businesses through the SBA loans, EDL and PPP programs. These programs were announced in a very rapid way, and banks were not ready to take on these new applications, and scammers quickly took advantage of the confusion and lack of preparation and started scamming and phishing campaigns regarding these various loan programs. As a result of the scams, millions were handed out to scammers. In a report compiled by the SBA, some companies also applied for multiple loans in other companies' names, and one company was actually caught applying for 85 loans, which they were actually granted. What we also saw is a rapid increase in fraud in healthcare procurement. There's a really good example where someone actually tweeted Donald Trump around ventilators. Donald Trump had one of his team members reach out to this person, and this person scammed New York out of $69.1 million, where 1,450 ventilators were meant to be delivered at 3 times the market rate, but no ventilators were ever delivered. An additional $355 million was spent on medical equipment and PPE. Most of this funding went to companies who were not in the healthcare business, including high-end fashion brands, Chinese iron ore and tool importers, personal hygiene companies, and oil companies. Now, it should be mentioned that some of these companies had good intentions of actually trying to help the company through the pandemic, but some of them merely saw it as a cash grab. One of the threats that also started emerging was phishing. What scammers would start to do is look for new employees that were joining companies through LinkedIn, and then they would either pretend to be the new employees and call the IT team to get their credentials, or the scammers were pretending to be from IT and called these new employees to get their credentials out of them. And this happened to both Bank of America as well as AT&T and Verizon, as well as GitHub. So the next theme that we'll have a look at is online game cheating. In previous years, I've spoken about the emergence of online game cheating, and it's definitely not a new phenomenon. There have been a myriad of talks in the early 2000s at DEF CON about online game cheating. A lot of these cheats often use tooling to manipulate memory and pointers to give the players that use them an unfair advantage. This often allows players to be invisible to other players, get unlimited ammo, currency or health, to change their positions or to jump around opponents, to shoot or see through walls, to create bullets that appear out of nowhere, as well as to get aiming assistance. As I spoke about last year, there was a massive increase in online game cheating, especially with the Fortnite World Cup that took place, where over 1,200 players were banned for cheating. And with the lockdowns in place, many turned to online games for entertainment, resulting in record-breaking numbers of online users. Steam actually broke its concurrent number of users multiple times over the past year. One of the things that started occurring as esports tournaments went remote, a lot of the servers experienced DDoS attacks, leading to a huge amount of frustration amongst pro players. So as these DDoS attacks started to take place, tournament organizers had to come up with new ways on how to deal with the problem. A lot of them started to stream gameplay after it had taken place. This had the unfortunate side effect which affected the gambling part and betting part of the tournament. A lot of these tournaments had over $100,000 in prize money who could predict various brackets correctly. And a lot of these results for the games that had taken place, ranking websites were publishing the results before the game had been streamed, allowing bettors to place bets knowing the result before the game was actually officially streamed, which a lot of people found unfair. What was very funny though was to see some of the resistance to this online game cheating. A YouTuber called ScriptKid decided to take revenge and created a fake set of cheats which people downloaded. He marketed this through Google Ads, and what would happen, a cheater who was using the software during the game, this fake software would randomly hand out punishments to the players that were using it, including dropping bombs and mollies, shooting their teammates, randomly starting to spin. There were trigger points on certain maps so that players will jump off the map. Some players would drop their guns, and in some cases it would play a sound effect when the player shoots, but wouldn't actually pull the trigger of the weapon. What we also saw is the UK National Crime Agency taking out adverts to dissuade teenagers from buying stressor or DDoS services. In research published by Cambridge, it actually showed that there was a remarkable decrease through these campaigns, which I think is quite an interesting initiative. So one of the big concerns over the past year was, with the rise of the pandemic, was that healthcare started to come under attack. Pharmaceutical companies started investing a large amount of money into vaccine research. There's over 100 vaccines currently in development, and these are different types of vaccines, including sterilizing vaccines and functional immunity vaccines that work in different ways. And what I've done is I've highlighted some of the most prominent vaccine candidates. We have the 2 candidates from Russia, as well as a number of other countries, including Moderna from the USA, the combined effort between the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca from the UK, Pfizer and BioNTech from the USA, Johnson & Johnson and Emerging Biosolutions from the USA, and Novavax also from the USA. And some of these vaccines are currently being tested in country. We know from earlier this week that the Pfizer vaccine has an efficacy rate of 90%, which is unheard of. Most influenza type vaccines like the flu shot typically have an efficacy rate of between 50 and 60%. One of the things that we know at the moment is no matter who is first to market, there will be a supply constraint. Various pharmaceutical companies have mentioned that they'll be able to manufacture between 20 and 50 million vials of the vaccine and about 1 billion vials each respectively next year. One of the challenges with the mRNA vaccines, like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, is that they need to be transported at very low temperatures, and a lot of logistics chains cannot actually handle that. As we have seen with the vaccine development, we've also seen a massive rise in the attacks against these pharmaceutical companies, resulting in the NCSC and CSER issuing a joint statement about these attacks from nation-state actors. You can imagine on the global stage, various nations want to be the first to have a vaccine, and thus have issued tasking to their intelligence agencies to get this information, especially information relating to the vaccine itself and how it's produced, so that if they need to get any ingredients, they are able to do that. Some of the most common forms of these attacks were spearfishing campaigns, password spraying with credential stuffing, as well as exploitation of known vulnerabilities on various systems and devices. DHS published a list of 25 vulnerabilities which are the most exploited by nation-state actors, for example, Chinese APT28. And I think it's shameful that 8 of these vulnerabilities are security products. So nation-state actors are exploiting vulnerabilities in software and hardware, which is meant to keep an organization safe, yet they are being used as an vector in order to break into a company. So we saw charges being filed against Chinese state actors. They are alleged to have broken into a number of companies around the world across various industries, and they are also have been alleged to have broken into some companies to steal COVID-19 research. So what we started to see was a rise in ransomware attacks that were targeted at hospitals. A patient died in a German hospital after they were hit with ransomware. His treatment was delayed, which resulted in him passing away. Many ransomware gangs actually came out quite publicly saying that they won't attack hospitals. However, many attacks still took place across Europe, the UK, US, and other countries as well. And this led obviously to a slew of jokes that if you attack a US hospital, that's a very good way to get vanned or droned. So the next theme was contact tracing. So as the virus started to spread, people wanted to start linking infections between people, and they did this typically through forms and surveys. The survey that I'm showing you here is the survey that you need to complete if you travel internationally. However, many of these forms were hosted on websites or were using products where the data, potentially sensitive data, was not actually wasn't secured properly. So many contact tracing solutions were proposed, which mainly fell into two categories: a decentralized approach and a centralized approach. One of the big challenges with this was how to collect these tokens in a privacy-preserving way. Apple and Google formed a joint initiative to work on a privacy-preserving contact tracing solution together, and they did this through their Exposure API, which is compatible on both of their platforms. The system relies on cryptography to ensure that maximum privacy is attained. The system works by broadcasting a random ID from the person's device, which also then collects these various IDs of other devices that it interacts with and records the time and distance between them. If a user tests positive for COVID-19 or is unwell, they can flag themselves with a token which is then uploaded to the service. Various user devices then download these tokens and look for other tokens that they may have interacted with. If the token matches, the app calculates a risk score and then lets the user know that they should probably be tested because they have come into contact with an infected person. Some of the challenges around the contact tracing solution was concerns around how trolls may abuse the reporting functions in the various apps. In a centralized approach, the collection of sensitive data such as location data could be misused for other purposes not related to contact tracing. And as contact tracing started to happen, contact tracers started calling people, letting them know that they had come into contact with somebody that was infected. However, there was no way of knowing if you were actually speaking to a legitimate contact tracer, something which various scammers took advantage of to extract sensitive data out of people, especially the elderly. There was also an interesting fail where 16,000 COVID cases went unreported in the UK because officials exceeded the Excel spreadsheet limit. So next is malware and ransomware. In 2019, we saw an increasing sophistication of threat capabilities with many exploits using multi-stage attacks. Emotet and TrickBot still remain some of the most commonly found and deployed malware currently. The number of malware families have actually decreased over the past year, but there has been a significant increase in ransomware attacks. One of the interesting trends is that attacks are actually now starting to be staged. So what ransomware gangs would do is they would infect an organization using droppers in malware, and they would wait until multiple people had been infected before actually triggering the ransomware to actually encrypt data. This way, they can actually encrypt a lot of data before an incident response team would be able to isolate it. And a lot of incident response playbooks assume that one device gets infected at a time. However, it would be quite a problem if multiple devices started encrypting files at the same time. And adware and spyware is still a big problem. So the way that Emotet typically works is it would send malicious attachments through mail spam, and these emails typically contain a malicious Office document or a link to a malicious Office file that users are told to download onto their PCs. So the way that this would work is someone would get a file, they would open it, there would be macros in the document, they would then open it and enable macros, and then the malware would execute and would infect the machine. One of the things that we saw back in 2018 was that when Emotet infected a system, it would go download a number of other malware families as well. One of them was TrickBot, which is a banking Trojan, which would steal credentials off system by harvesting emails and by using Mimikatz. However, at the beginning of this year, we started to see that Emotet would only deliver TrickBot, and this time TrickBot wasn't just a banking Trojan, it was also dropping ransomware in many cases. And there was an interesting case where a vigilante was actually sabotaging the Emotet botnet by replacing a lot of the malware payloads with GIFs. Now, a lot of these malware payloads are actually stored on hacked WordPress sites, and these temporary hosting locations are actually the Achilles heel of Emotet. So it was interesting to see this happening. And with the US elections, there was growing concern that the TrickBot botnet would be used to interfere with US elections. So we saw action taken by Cyber Command and Microsoft to take down the TrickBot botnet. Microsoft used copyright and trademark law to disable 120 of the 128 known command and control servers. This took out 94% of the TrickBot infrastructure. What we also saw was an unusual move by the NSA to drop a report on new Linux malware that they had found from the Russian GRU APT28, otherwise known as FantyBear. The malware is called DroverRub, which is seen as the cream of the crop with regards to Linux malware. It is seen as the Swiss Army knife for hacking into Linux because it provides full privileged backdoor access to Linux systems. We also saw some action from Microsoft where they removed 18 Azure AD apps that were being used by Chinese state-sponsored hackers. We also saw in October that charges were filed against 6 Russian military intelligence officers for intrusion into multiple computer systems around the world. This included attacks against the Olympics, the French elections, and attacks against the Ukraine government and infrastructure. They are also alleged to be behind the global NotPetya ransomware campaign. We also saw charges being filed against The Chinese attackers from the company Chengdu 404, otherwise known as APT41. This company provided pen testing and other white hat type security services. However, they are alleged to have participated in state-sponsored attacks, including attacks in the United States, France, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. In a rare instance, we actually started to see Russian businesses also getting attacked with ransomware. Now, it's an unofficial rule in the cyber underground world to not attack former Soviet space. In fact, a lot of ransomware malware will actually check whether they are in a CIS country. These are countries that are formerly part of the Soviet Union, which includes Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. And what would happen is the malware would check the time zone, location, and country that it was in. And if it found itself in one of these countries, the malware actually wouldn't infect the computer that it was on. One of the leading theories is that whoever's behind this ransomware campaign actually lives in one of the CIS countries but doesn't live in Russia and is actually trying to use this to get back at Russia in some way, but that's just a theory at this point in time. So one of the big ransomware attacks that took place over the past year was the attack on Garmin. The attack started on the 23rd of July and knocked out a whole bunch of their services, including fitness tracking services, customer support, and commercial aviation offerings. There are conflicting reports about exactly what ransomware family was used. However, it is believed that the Tridex malware was used to deliver the Wasted Locker ransomware into the environment. The initial infection mechanism was a drive-by compromise where it is alleged that somebody downloaded a fake file or potentially for a browser, and this then triggered the ransomware to execute in the environment. Garmin paid a $10 million ransomware. Garmin paid a $10 million ransom, either directly or indirectly through a third party, and in doing so violated US sanctions. So after this happened, the Office of Foreign Assets and Control in the US issued a statement effectively banning ransomware payments to these sanctioned entities, which includes EvilCorp, CryptoLocker, WannaCry, and Samsung. These, if a company pays a ransom, they can face both civil and criminal penalties up to $1 million and 20 years in prison. But will sanctions really work? I don't believe that they will. Making something illegal hasn't stopped it from happening. If we just look at corruption, tax evasion, and the drug war, making something illegal really hasn't stopped it from happening. And we need to look at the case of paying for ransom versus the case against paying for ransom. Now, if a company finds itself in a situation where all of its data and systems are encrypted and its business depends on having that data and systems available, it could potentially go out of business, which would lead to a loss of tax revenue for the state and a loss of jobs. And if a payment is made under duress, that is under the threat of life, there's an interesting self-defense argument that could be made. Since a corporation is a separate legal entity, it has similar rights to a person. Therefore, if it is threatened, it has the right to self-defense. And that could be an interesting legal argument to be made in court. And this could potentially lead to jury sympathy if a jury trial occurs for criminal charges. However, they would argue that payments may lead to additional attacks taking place, the potential national security risk, and that the people that are behind these attacks may actually use the funding to continue their campaigns against other companies. Another big theme of 2020 was the insider threat. So earlier this year, we saw a number of Twitter accounts getting compromised. So on the 15th of July, a number of accounts were compromised and messages were posted directing people to pay Bitcoin started to appear. Initially, these tweets contained a URL which contained instructions on where to send Bitcoin. Once that site was taken down, these attackers pivoted to tweeting out the Bitcoin address where Bitcoin should be sent. You know, if you send me some Bitcoin, I'll send you double in return. And popular accounts such as Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Kanye West, Elon Musk, Apple, and Uber, amongst many others, were targeted. When this happened, I initially thought that this was the result of some kind of third-party breach. At the beginning of the year, we saw a number of NFL teams' Twitter accounts getting compromised because they were using a third-party social media analytics company whose infrastructure was compromised, and that infrastructure was then used to take over these various Twitter accounts. However, it actually turned out that a number of Twitter employees were actually social engineered, and that access that they managed to gain through the social engineering was used to gain access to their systems. Twitter had a tool where people could go read other so Twitter had an internal tool that would allow their internal staff members to read other people's data, including performing functions like password resets. The password to this internal tool was actually published on a Slack channel, which these attackers managed to gain access to. And as part of the attacks, over 130 Twitter accounts were targeted with these tweets. 8 accounts had their data downloaded from Twitter, and this resulted in 426 Bitcoin transfers were processed to the address mentioned in the tweets, and that totaled around 13 Bitcoins with a total value of $117,000. And I think given the enormity of this situation, I think $117,000 is really peanuts. There could have been much worse things happening with the access that was gained through this tool. The way that the attackers were found is that a joint investigation by the FBI, Secret Service, and IRS was conducted, and the FBI used its copy of the OG users forum database, which had been hijacked by a rival firm a few months before, and by combining that data with some chat logs, they managed to track down Graham Clark, who was 17 at the time. He's the main accused or the mastermind behind these attacks. Graham was already known to law enforcement because he had participated in various SIM swapping activities and had accrued over $1 million and was living by himself in an apartment in Florida. He was granted bail of $725,000. His co-conspirators were charged. It's unclear at this point whether Graham will be charged as a minor or as an adult. So one of the other insider threats that occurred was the attack on Tesla, where a Russian citizen had migrated to the US and was working legally for Tesla in their Nevada factory. Then another Russian citizen approached this Russian migrant with an offer of $1 million to plant ransomware onto Tesla's network, which would be done directly through a USB drive. And when this attack took place, the ransomware gang would perform a DDoS attack against Tesla to distract the security team while the ransomware was actually running. However, the employee went to management after this had happened. Tesla called in the FBI, and this employee with the FBI then set up a sting operation where this person was arrested and has now subsequently been charged. Another big theme of 2020 was disinformation. So 2020 was really a train wreck of issues. We had a global pandemic, a US elections, mass global protests around racism, police brutality, and climate change really led itself to becoming a melting pot of issues which could be used to spread misinformation and disinformation. What we've seen with disinformation since the 2016 election is that the number of pages and accounts spreading disinformation has increased sharply. Typically, these disinformation campaigns are often created by nation-state actors, mainly to interfere with the politics of other countries. However, increasingly, some of this disinformation is actually being created by other groups with other interests, and not just governments. In 2016, we know from the Mueller report how Russia used advertising to spread information, and it's easy to think that this disinformation pandemic is only, or the infodemic is only related to the US. However, there are many other countries that are being targeted as well. In Myanmar, the government used Facebook and Instagram to share highly inflammatory messages. A lot of the content used emotional imagery to spark an emotional response by those who see it. Many of these accounts will post popular content and celebrity gossip to build audiences. Once they have an audience, they will then start sharing political messages. What you will also start to see is that a lot of these accounts share information in a highly coordinated way, and these pages then start building very significant audiences as they go with this. We also see a common tactic where pages will steal photos and profile photos from other users and pages. Tracking the links between all of these domains can be quite a hard thing to do, and there's a number of researchers that have been tracking the links between all of the domains. Not only can this be quite difficult, but it can be quite helpful to link domains and the actors that are behind them. What we started to see as well with the US elections is the rise of information operations. So we saw information operations from Russia, China and Iran trying to interfere with the US election. What we saw Russia doing was they created a website called Peace Data, where they used freelance journalists to write stories and then published them using fake names and accounts. These accounts were then created using fake profile photos which were generated using artificial intelligence. And another website called the Newsroom for American and European-based citizens was also created, and once this came to the attention of the various social media platforms, these accounts were suspended and links to these websites were also prohibited from being shared. We also saw the story about Biden's secret emails, which is actually a story planted by Russian officials against Rudy Giuliani. What we also saw previously is that QAnon likes to spread conspiracy theories. They have subsequently been declared a domestic terrorism threat. Previously, we saw conspiracies including human trafficking rings, alleged criminal activities, and anti-vax movements. These conspiracies have led to people committing real-world crimes such as shootings and kidnappings with the belief that they are actually helping the cause. And one of these crimes included an innocent person who was portrayed as a mob boss who was completely innocent, but then was gunned down by somebody that believed in the conspiracy. And with the global pandemic, a lot of the conspiracies are centered around COVID-19. So here was just some examples of campaigns that we saw from Mexico and Spain against US elections. And again, these campaigns would often use popular images for engagement and other content to appear authentic. So social media platforms got a lot of criticism from the 2016 US elections. They have been quite decisive in 2020 against taking actions against these disinformation campaigns. One of the things that they also did was they started placing labels on misleading content. For example, the election fraud allegations made by Donald Trump started to see labels being put on that it was misleading, as well as other tweets that were claiming the same thing. One of the consequences of all of this disinformation is that some of these conspiracy theories, for example, the 5G conspiracy theory that alleged that 5G infrastructure was led to the spread of the coronavirus, led to some people in the UK actually setting cell phone towers alight, even though some of them were not actually 5G towers. And the UK is treating this as a national security threat because not everybody has broadband access and relies on these towers, as well as a lot of these towers support the ESN network, which is used by first responders. And one of the big concerns that I have over the next year is that we're going to see a lot of disinformation and misinformation around COVID-19. And sometimes it's not always intentional. If we look at this example from the Washington Post, depending on what Twitter client you had, you may have gotten a different version of this article. So if you only read the tweet, you would have thought that the Oxford vaccine had killed somebody. Whereas if you actually saw the tweet with the headline, you would have seen that the person who died actually didn't get the vaccine. They got a placebo and not the real vaccine. Thus, there shouldn't be anything to be concerned about. So next up is the Wechat and TikTok ban. So TikTok has seen unprecedented growth over the past 4 years. In 2004, it took Facebook a year to get 1 million users. In the same time period, TikTok had managed to amass over 100 million users and has made its Chinese parent company ByteDance one of the most valuable companies in the world. As TikTok became very popular, a lot of rhetoric started to be thrown around regarding the privacy implications of TikTok. There have been many posts claiming that user data is being harvested so the Chinese government can use it in various nefarious ways. And this is despite the fact that many other social media apps like Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram collect the same amounts of data, and in some cases even more data than TikTok is collecting. And yes, the Chinese national intelligence law is often cited as one of the big concerns with TikTok. So TikTok has grown very quickly in India before protests demanded that TikTok be banned so that local apps can grow. India has since banned several other Chinese apps, including Wechat. These privacy concerns have led to many companies banning TikTok from their devices, and this includes the US military branches. Donald Trump has spread a lot of disinformation around TikTok and has tried to use the CIFAS and IEPA laws to ban both TikTok and WeChat from the US. There's a lot of legal action currently going on about this. It's unclear why this is the case, but it seems that this is linked to his trade war against China, and TikTok users also sabotaged the attendance on one of his rallies by registering that they would attend, but then obviously not actually going to the event, and this may have upset Trump to a certain degree. I don't normally use memes in my presentations, but I thought this one to be quite funny, which says, if you want to steal my data, you have to be a US-based corporation. And one of the arguments for the Wechat ban is that US interests need to be looked after, and if TikTok is a growing company, that is a non-US company and should be stopped. So one of the conditions for TikTok to continue working in the US is that some of the operations need to be taken over by a US company, and TikTok has by a US company, and Oracle has agreed to be TikTok's official technology partner, which spawned a lot of jokes about Oracle Cloud gets its first customer, and also the fact that Donald Trump is the Oracle Cloud salesperson of the year. And what also then came out was that Oracle's Larry Ellison had actually donated $250,000 to Lindsey Graham's super PAC days before the TikTok deal went through, which obviously is no big surprise there. The next theme that I would like to talk about is satellite security. So a large part of the world's population lacks access to high-speed internet, something which the pandemic really demonstrated. And in order to solve this, SpaceX is planning to have 12,000 satellites in low Earth orbit within the next 6 to 9 years, with plans for further expansion up to 42,000 satellites in the future. Currently, SpaceX can manufacture and launch 60 satellites every 2 weeks, but this does bring up an interesting question around what would the network of the future potentially look like? Are satellites potentially going to be the new network edge in the future? And because these satellites are in low Earth orbit, they can actually achieve lower latencies than some of the fiber optic cables today. So if we look at the latency between London and Johannesburg, currently on fiber that's about 90 seconds, where on satellite that could be as low as 77 milliseconds. This obviously depends quite heavily on weather conditions. So as part of the Starlink program, it has seen 15 launches, with 13 of those launches taking place this year, which has delivered 895 satellites into orbit. It has been amazing to see how quickly SpaceX has been able to launch these rockets. In the past, you would only typically see a handful of launches every year, and as an av geek, it's really great to see how fast they are being able to launch these rockets. So far this year, we've already seen 21 launches and only 2 failed landing attempts. In June, there were a total of 4 launches. We had the NASA Crew Demo 2 mission, and then 2 Starlink missions, and then a GPS mission followed after that. And on the day of this conference, the first official crew mission from NASA will actually be launching late in the evening. So satellite security is not something that has seen a lot of attention in the past, something which the aerospace village at DEF CON wanted to change, and they hosted a Hackersat Contest with a prize of $50,000. So qualification rounds took place, after which teams had to complete several challenges. So teams were given their own flat sat to test code on. There was a room where the satellites were orbiting inside the room, and these flat sats were sitting in a carousel and were sitting on air-supported bearings so that the attitude control systems could keep the satellite in the right orientation. So these flat sats were running a core flight system that was developed by NASA, and the winning team managed to run their code on a real-world satellite, which is alleged to be the AeroCube 10B satellite, which was launched in 2019. So moving on to the last theme of the year, which is around encryption. So last year we saw 90% of the internet is encrypted. That's up to 95% today. We know from the certificate transparency logs that last year we had over 1 billion valid certificates, which was quite a milestone. However, the number of valid certificates has now declined to 700 million. It's unclear whether the pandemic had any impact in this. Maybe people stopped creating certificates for their Kubernetes containers. We also saw certificate issuance start to increase. So in 2018, we saw 700,000 certificates being issued per day. That increased to 2.9 million certificates that were being issued per day. We saw that increase in 2020 to 4.9 million certificates being issued per day. This means that the issuance rate has increased to 193,000 certificates per hour. From a market share perspective, Let's Encrypt has increased its market share to 78%, with Citigo, formerly Komodo, dropping down to 10%. What we also saw is the increased adoption of elliptic curve cryptography. So from 2018 it was 7%, 2019 10%, and in 2020 it's up to 17%. However, due to the rapid growth between 2018 and 2019, even though percentage-wise it only increased by 3%, it actually saw a 5-fold increase in the number of certificates. Unfortunately, many cloud services still don't support elliptic curve yet. We did see an interesting crypto bug being reported by the NSA in the Windows Crypto API DLL, which validates elliptic curve cryptography certificates, which would allow an attacker to perform a man-in-the-middle attack. In closing, I would like to make some predictions for 2021. I mentioned earlier on, I think we're going to see a huge amount of COVID-19 vaccine disinformation. As budgets tighten with the economic situation that we have, as security spend will decrease. This will lead to larger and more complex ransomware attacks. We'll continue to see advancements in zero trust tooling and software. We'll see an increase in data breaches from manufacturers and retailers. We'll see TLS 1.3 bugs and other crypto bugs. Attackers will focus their attention on attacking the home. We'll see the continued misuse of deepfakes and other AI. We'll see the increased adoption of cyber insurance, and we'll see attacks and misconfigurations of SAML infrastructure. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.